Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. In the early 1400s, China launched the largest naval expeditions the world had ever seen. Its ships were floating cities, some carrying more men than entire European towns. Decades before Columbus ever left Spain, these fleets crossed oceans with confidence and scale Europe could not match. Then suddenly they stopped. The shipyards fell silent. The records disappeared. The ocean closed. And China, despite having every advantage, never tried to cross the Pacific again. This was not a technological failure. It was a decision. And to understand why China never colonized America, we have to understand what forced that decision, what China was afraid of losing, and what it believed was truly at stake. In the early 15th century, it looked as if China was about to become the world's first global maritime power. Under the Ming dynasty, the court authorized the construction of an enormous fleet unlike anything seen before. Hundreds of ships were built, some towering over European vessels of the same era, crewed by tens of thousands of sailors, soldiers, and officials. At the center of this effort stood Zheng He, a trusted admiral of the Mongol emperor. Over the course of 7 major voyages, his fleets sailed from China through Southeast Asia, across the Indian Ocean, and as far as the coasts of Arabia and East Africa. Wherever they arrived, they announced Chinese power, with overwhelming presence rather than violence. Local rulers received envoys, exchanged gifts, and acknowledged the authority of the Ming emperor. To later observers, this moment looks like the beginning of something much larger. China had the ships, it had the manpower, it had the organization. If any civilization was positioned to dominate the seas, it was this one. The question seems almost obvious. If China could reach Africa, why not keep going? Why not push farther east, across the Pacific? But that assumption misunderstands what these voyages were meant to accomplish. Zheng He was not searching for new land to settle. His fleets carried no colonists, no farming communities, no plans for permanent overseas rule. They carried officials, ceremonial goods, and soldiers whose purpose was to be seen, not to stay. The voyages were designed to send a message, not to open a frontier. After decades of Mongol rule, the Ming court was reasserting its authority over the known world. These expeditions were proof that China had returned to the center, that distant rulers still recognized its supremacy, and that order had been restored. For the moment, it worked. Tribute flowed back to China. Exotic animals arrived at the imperial court. The empire's prestige soared. From the outside, it looked like the opening act of global dominance. But inside the Ming state, a very different calculation was already underway. The fleets were expensive. Their returns were symbolic, not economic. And far from the coast, beyond the ceremony and spectacle, another threat was growing, one that mattered far more to the survival of the dynasty than anything across the ocean. The moment that made China appear ready to rule the seas was also the moment it began to turn away from them. The end of China's great maritime experiment did not come with an announcement. There was no proclamation declaring the ocean off limits, no dramatic rejection of exploration. Instead, the fleet simply failed to sail again. After the final voyage of Zheng He in the 1430s, the Ming court quietly withdrew its support. Funding was reduced. Shipyards that had once produced massive ocean-going vessels were reassigned to rivercraft and transport barges. Naval records were allowed to decay, and in some cases deliberately destroyed. Within a single generation, the institutional memory of long-distance seafaring began to fade. This retreat is often misunderstood as cultural conservatism or bureaucratic short-sightedness. In reality, it was driven by pressure, urgent, immediate, and dangerous pressure that had nothing to do with the sea. While Zheng He's fleets were projecting power thousands of miles away, the Ming state was facing threats much closer to home. To the north, beyond the Great Wall, the descendants of the Mongols had not disappeared. They had fragmented, reorganized, and returned as a persistent military danger. Raids along the frontier were frequent. Entire regions could be devastated in a single campaign. For the Ming rulers, this was not a theoretical concern. It was an existential one. Defending the northern border required enormous resources. Armies had to be maintained, fortifications repaired and expanded, supply lines secured. Silver, timber, iron, and manpower were finite. Every coin spent on ships was a coin not spent on soldiers. Every tree cut for a mast was one not used for walls, watchtowers, or siege equipment. Inside the court, this trade-off became impossible to ignore. The treasure fleets brought prestige, but they did not stop nomads from burning villages or threatening the capital. They did not secure the grain harvest or guarantee internal stability. In moments of crisis, symbolic power mattered far less than physical defense. The decision was never framed as choosing land over sea in the abstract. It was framed as choosing survival over spectacle. Faced with the reality of frontier war, the Ming court redirected its resources toward what it believed truly mattered, holding the empire together. Once that choice was made, everything else followed naturally. The fleets were no longer essential. The ocean no longer offered solutions. And the idea of pushing even farther, toward lands unknown and uncontrollable, became not just unnecessary, but reckless. China did not turn away from the sea because it lacked ambition. It turned away because it was already fighting for its life. To understand how final the decision truly was, it helps to look north, away from the oceans entirely. The greatest danger to the Ming dynasty was not distant and hypothetical. It was immediate, violent, and familiar. The Mongols had ruled China for nearly a century. Their fall did not erase them. It fractured their power into rival khanates that roamed the steppe, launching raids deep into Chinese territory. These were not symbolic incursions. Towns were burned, crops were destroyed. Entire regions could be destabilized in a single season. For Ming emperors, this threat was personal. The dynasty itself had been born from rebellion against foreign rule. Its legitimacy depended on preventing that history from repeating. Losing control of the north did not mean embarrassment. It meant collapse. War on the frontier was expensive in ways overseas exploration never was. Cavalry had to be raised and fed. Garrisons had to be maintained year-round. Fortifications required constant repair. Even the Great Wall, often imagined as a static monument, was a living military system that consumed vast quantities of labor and materials. Every strategic decision became a zero-sum calculation. Timber could become ship hulls or watchtowers. Iron could become anchors or weapons. Taxes could fund fleets sailing ceremonial routes or armies standing between the capital and invasion. The Ming court did not debate this in philosophical terms. The consequences were visible in blood and ash. This context reframes the end of the treasure fleets entirely. China did not abandon maritime power because it failed to see its potential. It abandoned it because maritime power did nothing to solve the crisis that mattered most. Oceans could be crossed, empires could be impressed, but none of it stopped Mongol horsemen from riding south. The Northern War also shaped how risk was understood. Stability was not an abstract ideal. It was the difference between continuity and chaos. Anything that diverted attention or resources away from that struggle was suspect. Long-distance exploration, with its delayed returns and uncertain benefits, fit that category perfectly. By the mid-15th century, the Ming state had made its priority unmistakable. The future of China would be decided on land, not at sea. Whatever lay beyond the eastern horizon would have to wait, because the empire was already fighting a war it could not afford to lose. Once the Ming court committed to fighting for survival on land, it needed a way to manage the world beyond its borders without opening new fronts. The solution was not retreat, but control. Specifically, a form of control that avoided permanent risk. This was where the tributary system mattered. Long before European colonies existed, China had developed a method of projecting power without occupation. Foreign rulers were invited to send envoys, present tribute, and acknowledge the emperor's supremacy. In return, they received trade access, protection, and legitimacy. The relationship was unequal by design, and from the Ming perspective, stable. Compared to overseas colonies, this system was remarkably efficient. It required no settlers, no distant garrisons, and no costly administration across oceans. The burden of travel fell on outsiders, not the Chinese state. Prestige flowed inward, order was reinforced, and crucially, the empire retained the ability to disengage at any moment without catastrophic loss. This approach made sense in a world where threats were immediate and resources finite. Colonies demanded constant attention. They created new enemies, new expenses, and new vulnerabilities. The tributary system did the opposite. It limited exposure while preserving influence. Seen this way, the decision to abandon long-range naval expeditions was not isolationism, it was risk management. China did not need to conquer distant lands to be powerful. It needed to ensure that nothing, foreign or domestic, disrupted the fragile balance it had rebuilt after Mongol rule. This was the safer empire, one that chose predictability over possibility, hierarchy over improvisation, and control over reach. The sea was no longer a frontier worth gambling on. It was a boundary, useful when regulated, dangerous when ignored. By choosing this path, China did not fall behind overnight. In fact, for centuries, it worked. The empire remained wealthy, populous, and secure, while much of the world remained unstable. But that same choice would also shape how China expanded next, and reveal a twist that most modern viewers never expect. What makes China's story easy to misunderstand is the assumption that expansion only counts if it crosses oceans. Measured that way, China appears passive after the 15th century. Measured differently, it was anything but. While maritime ambitions faded, Chinese power surged across land. Under the Qing dynasty, which replaced the Ming in the 17th century, the empire expanded to its greatest territorial extent. Vast regions to the north and west, Mongolia, Xinjiang, Tibet, were absorbed through conquest, alliance, and sustained military presence. This was not symbolic influence. It was direct rule. This expansion was deliberate. These regions bordered the heartland and had long been sources of instability. Bringing them under imperial control reduced the threat of invasion and secured trade routes and resources that mattered to the state's survival. Unlike overseas colonies, these territories could be governed through systems China already understood: garrisons, taxation, migration, and bureaucracy. In other words, China did colonize, just not across the sea. It chose a form of empire that prioritized depth over distance. Land-based expansion allowed the court to apply pressure continuously, respond quickly to rebellion, and maintain a clear chain of command. Authority could be enforced. Order could be restored when it broke down. This is the moment where the familiar narrative breaks. China did not reject expansion as such. It rejected unmanageable expansion. Oceans created distance, delay, and autonomy, conditions that had repeatedly proven dangerous to centralized rule. Land empires, by contrast, could be absorbed, monitored, and defended. For a state shaped by the trauma of foreign conquest, this distinction mattered more than ideology. The Qing emperors were not asking how to project power as far as possible. They were asking how to make it permanent. By that standard, riding westward with armies made far more sense than sailing eastward into uncertainty. The twist, then, is not that China failed to build an empire. It is that it built one where its power worked best, on land, where control could be maintained, and where threats could be neutralized before they reached the center. For centuries, China's choices paid off. The empire remained cohesive, prosperous, and secure, while much of the world was torn apart by constant rivalry. Its borders were stabilized, its population grew, its institutions endured. By almost any measure available at the time, the strategy had worked. But the world beyond China did not stand still. European powers, driven by competition and scarcity, accepted risks China had rejected. Their overseas colonies were unstable, expensive, and often violent, but they generated wealth, manpower, and technological momentum. Over time, these advantages compounded. The very chaos China had avoided became the engine of Europe's rise. When sustained contact between China and European empires finally became unavoidable, the imbalance was clear. Europeans arrived not as peripheral traders seeking recognition, but as powers demanding access and leverage. They operated outside the tributary logic, negotiating as equals, or forcing concessions when refused. China's institutions, designed for control and continuity, struggled to adapt. This was not because Chinese leaders lacked intelligence or foresight, but because their system had been optimized for a different world. Stability had been the right choice for survival in the short term. In the long term, it limited flexibility. This is where the irony of the story emerges. China avoided overseas colonization because it posed unacceptable risks. Europe embraced those risks and eventually reshaped the global order. By the time the costs of restraint became visible, the conditions that once made restraint rational were already gone. And yet, even here, the answer to the original question remains the same. China did not fail to colonize America because it was incapable or unaware. It did not miss an obvious opportunity. It made a calculated choice, one that prioritized survival, control, and internal balance over distant ambition. The result was an empire that endured for centuries, but one that stepped aside as the world began to reward a different kind of power.